Welcome everyone, and greetings to everybody, to all the speakers that are with us, participants at this symposium, and all the online audience, either recorded or live around the world. I think mostly in Slovenia, the Netherlands, but also elsewhere. My name is Gorazd Andrejic. I'm a lecturer, assistant professor in philosophy of religion at Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, University of Groningen. And I'm also a researcher at Institute of Philosophical Studies at Science and Research Center of Koper. This symposium is organized by these two institutions, which I happen to be working with both of them. It is a part of an ongoing research project called Creatures, Humans and Robots, which is an interdisciplinary project with philosophers, theologians, intellectual historians, aestheticists, giving their contribution to this project. And it is being funded by Slovenian Research Agency, or RRS. Also, I should like to say at the beginning that this event is part of the broader World Philosophy Day organized by Slovenian Philosophical Society. I think we are as kind of a part of a side program, if I'm not mistaken, not one of the main things of the program, which is fine with me, but it's just, I think this is how our event has been characterized. Maybe I would like to invite now Gašper Pirc, who is, I think, who is as a president of Slovenian Philosophical Society, who is at the moment also our technical person who is trying to make things work here with streaming, to say a few words about the World Philosophy Day and the International Day of Philosophy, but also, you know, anything else you want to say, Gašper?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would really like to apologize everyone due to the situation we're having. But Zoom is a bit unpredictable, and we are having a discussion on AI, and it's kind of unfortunate. And but I still hope that everything will be sorted out and the meeting will be successful. And it's just this technical difficulty. Sometimes the start is bad, but of course, if everything ends on a high note, it will be great. So I would like to also extend my thanks for everyone that came, and also would like to welcome you in the name of the Slovenian Philosophical Society, which is an organizer of the Days of Philosophy in Slovenia, and this event is also part of this. Of the proceedings there. So thank you very much for coming. I'm really sorry for everything so far, but I hope that everything will now start as it should. Thank you again, and I will give my, I will be short, so I will just give my the word to the next speaker, and
okay.
Enjoy.
Thank you, Gašper. Thank you. I would like to invite Mladen Popovic, the Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies here in Groningen, maybe to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome everyone to this wonderful symposium on religious philosophy between humanism and posthumanism, and then also indeed specifically focusing on AI. I find it also myself intriguing. I work with colleagues in AI on ancient manuscripts, and I'm fascinated by the human-machine cooperation and interaction, both of course on an operational level, but also very much on a conceptual level. And I wish you a very good conference these 2 days in thinking about the relationship between human-machine and what that has in terms of consequences for our future thinking. And I hope you have a very good conference. And again, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Also the cooperation between Groningen and Koper. And I look forward to what comes next out of that cooperation. So I wish you a very good conference with good discussions and also a fascinating follow-up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mladen, so much for this. I know that you have to go soon, so we will understand when you will have to vanish. But I hope your words will indeed be fulfilled in the future, also with further projects and cooperation. I will now invite Professor Leonard Schoff to say a few words as the head of our Institute of Philosophical Studies in Koper. So please, Leonard.
Yeah, also warm welcome to everyone on behalf of our Institute of Philosophical Studies. I'm really glad that we all have gathered both from our research team and of course all other colleagues and friends. Thanks to Goras for organizing this and to Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies from the University of Groningen. And we're really looking forward to this event and to all further cooperations, fruitful cooperations. We have started this now officially. Of course, once again, my sincere thanks to all our special guests from all over the world. And welcome, of course, also to all of you watching us on Facebook in live streaming. So thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. So I had a few words of wisdom prepared to lead us into our theme and so on, but because I feel that we have already used some time because of our technical problems, I would not say any wise words now. I will simply say that, this symposium, I think that the title of the symposium is in a way self-explanatory. It really is about the relevancy of post-humanist philosophy, in particular for philosophy of religion. If you have seen the program, you might have noticed there are very different kinds of contributions throughout these 2 days, this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon. Also from very different disciplines. I think it really is my hope that we will have an interesting conversation because also philosophical worlds that some of us inhabit are also, worlds apart. And I think this is exactly the point, not only of this symposium, but also of our project more broadly. We want to foster communication and exchange of ideas also through continental and analytical philosophical styles and so on. So our first presenter, I will now invite to start. It's my colleague at Institute of Philosophical Studies, Carol Kersten, who is also a professor or reader at King's College London. He is a renowned expert for Islamic studies and history of ideas in Islam in particular. And his talk is titled Towards a Theology of Dissipation and Extinction, Reza Nagarestani and the Inhuman. Please, Carol.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Goras, and thanks for the invitation. I'm sharing my screen. Is that visible for you guys? Yeah, perfect.
Works.
As you can see, a very heady title I have given to my talk, but I'm going to zero in on this subtitle, Reza Nagarestani and the Inhuman. Now, Nagarestani is an Iranian-born philosopher coming from the city of Shiraz, city of poets, but also of the 17th century Shia metaphysical philosopher Mullah Sadra. He has written 2 books. 2008, book appeared entitled Cyclonopedia, Complicity with Anonymous Materials, followed 10 years later by a more conventional philosophical book, Intelligence and Spirit, from 2018. This is a point where I'm immediately going to make a disclaimer in the sense that I am not a philosopher in the academic sense of the word. I'm a scholar of Islam, interested in particular in the intellectual history of the contemporary Muslim world. And my initial interest in Nagarestani's book, Cyclonopedia, was triggered by the Islamic reference it contains. Cyclonopedia is a bit of a weird book. It fits in a category called theory fiction. The term comes from Baudrillard. What caught my attention was this description of the book. Reading Cyclonopedia is like being converted to Islam by Salvador Dali. Well, then you have grabbed my attention. It has also been called as wrapping in one horror fiction, being an atlas of demonology, a work of speculative theology, a political samizdat, and a philosophic grimoire. That is all what this book pretends to be. It attained a bit of cult status in 2008, 2010. But this is not the book I'm going to talk about now. I'm going to shift to another aspect of Reza Negarestani's work. He namely fits also in a strand of contemporary philosophical thinking that is captured under the name speculative realism. Name goes back to a workshop convened at Goldsmith University in 2007 by 4 philosophers. You see their names here. 2 of them are going to make a reappearance in the course of my talk, namely Ray Brassier and Quentin Meillassoux. What unites speculative realists is what, well, Meillassoux has called that it is against correlationism, and he sees his own contribution not so much as speculative realism as speculative materialism. And another strand of speculative thinking represented by Graham Harman is object-oriented ontology, but that also presents itself as an alternative to philosophies of access. Correlationism and philosophies of access basically refers to the knowing subject-focused modern European philosophies since Kant. What I'm going to focus on now is Reza Negarestani's take on this notion of the inhuman and make a connection with that school of speculative realism, and also how it is sort of relevant for our project. The term the inhuman comes from a book by Jean-François Lyotard, and what it deals with is that in one of the essays in the book, Lyotard says that, well, if we determine that the sun is indeed dying to the same extent as that human existence is bounded by extinction, and if you then say that a cosmic extinction is as much an what he calls irrecusable factum for philosophy as the biological death of all living beings, then why should thought continue investing in accounts whose dwindling reserves are actually circumscribed by the temporal parameters of embodiment? Now that is picked up by Negarestani in 2 texts I'm going to focus on today. A chapter entitled Drafting the Inhuman, Conjectures on Capitalism and Organic Necrocracy, that appeared in an edited volume under the title The Speculative Turn. And in here, he primarily engages in a critique of 2 books. One, The Thirst of Annihilation by what is considered the godfather of speculative realism, Nick Land, although he has already disappeared from the academic philosophical scene in 1998, and Nihil Unbound by the earlier mentioned Ray Brassier. The research question in Drafting the Inhuman is the following. Does the capitalist model of accelerating planetary dissipation really effectuate an inhumanist model for emancipation that breaks away from what Reza Negarestani constantly calls the conservative humanism that is still very much tied up with these schools of accelerationist thinking? And his own objective is to actually wrest a radical conception of inhumanism from these capital nurturing hands of anti-humanism in its various forms. Because in his view, Nick Land's accelerationism, and the idea stands for the suggestion that capitalism should even be deepened and accelerated in order to prompt that radical change that is envisaged by its political agendas. And he calls that actually, and Negarestani actually calls that still a representation of conservative humanism. Negarestani namely acknowledges that capitalism is indeed ultimately emancipative in terms of other than those of the human, but he also insists that capitalism can be participated in and is accelerated by humans. So he says that does then not exclude an ethics or a politics of praxis exercised by human beings. Now, in terms of his engagement with Nihil Unbound, and I think there are many more affinities between Brassier and Negarestani, then between Negarestani and Nick Land. So I'm going to say a bit more about this book. It focuses indeed on these necrocratic regimes of the organisms living on our planet, but also the wider cosmos and the universe. It's that notion again of the extinction of the sun, which also featured already in that book Cyclonopedia, where Reza Negarestani talks about the black sun, and he makes this connection between the sun as a celestial body and also the fossil fuel resources that it actually has generated here on our planet. In regards to Brassier's take on nihilism, I want to show you in a few bullet points how it is a much more toned down version from the virulent form in which Nick Land presented it. Yes, the departure is indeed typically that of the speculative realists, that there is this unavoidable corollary of the realist conviction that there is mind-independent reality, and that thinking has interests that do not coincide with those of the living. It's in fact indifferent to our existence and also oblivious to values and meanings, but it's not necessarily an existential quandary, let alone a pathology. Instead, he gives it a positive twist. Nihilism, according to Brassier, is actually a speculative opportunity for thinking. He engages with a lot of interlocutors in that book. I'm not going to address all of them. I just lift out a few just to make the point how it feeds into the notion of Negarestani's take on the inhuman. First of all, Paul Churchland features prominently in Nihil Unbound, in the sense that Churchland declared what he called folk psychologism obsolete and presents an alternative, eliminative materialism, which in the shortest of terms can be summarized as an ascent from very simple neurobiological models of rudimentary sensory motor behavior to the ever more sophisticated varieties of linguistically mediated cognitive activity. And what he wants to do is drive a philosophical wedge between our phenomenological self-conceptions and the material processes through which that concept is produced. Fellow speculative realist Quentin Meillassoux, also very important to Brassier. I just briskly move through a few key points of his philosophy. It's presented as a rationalist critique of the critique of reason. It wants to rehabilitate reason's claim to access reality as it is in itself, free of any metaphysical accoutrement. The only certainty we have is absolute contingency. And there is no need for a time index that coheres a subjective relation to reality or a correlation between thinking and being. And also there is a notion of time, which I don't have time to go into, and that is the idea that time is both anterior and posterior to human thinking. Most relevant, I think, is the connection made by Brassier between the philosophies of Lyotard and Levinas, because he connects Lyotard's solar catastrophe, the extinction of the sun, and transposes it onto Levinas's theologically inflected impossibility of possibility into a natural scientific register. The death of the other, which is central to Levinas's thinking, no longer usurps the sovereignty of consciousness. That sovereignty is now given to the extinction of the sun as a guiding philosophical principle. And the catastrophic nature of extinction overturns then also notions of an origin and an end, the empirical and the transcendent, and what have you. An interesting but equally enigmatic phrase, because I'm not sure how to take this. Here I hide behind my disclaimer. Brassier qualifies this catastrophic extinction as either, you can call it a naturalization of eschatology or a theologization of cosmology. Now, Negarestani's verdict about Brassier is a bit more benign. He indeed acknowledges that Brassier's cosmic reinscription successfully eliminates the vitalistic horizon implicit in that anti-humanist definition of capitalism proposed by Nick Land, but it leaves still unharmed the aporetic truths of capitalism as this inevitable singularity for dissipation, but still bound to a conservative order of the anthropic horizon. So in that sense, Negarestani says that Brassier's Enlightenment project turns into a kind of a dormant ethical-political enterprise with an utopianistic twist. It's simply not yet good enough. And that brings us then to what is then required? What does the inhuman mean? That is addressed in an article that appeared in the 2014 issue of a journal called Accelerate and is entitled The Labor of the Inhuman. That second text central to Negarestani's conceptualization of the inhuman. And I'll try to walk you as brisk as possible through the key points in that text as well. I think it is a kind of a prolegomena to intelligence and spirit, namely in the sense that there is a new interlocutor introduced, Robert Brandom, who features prominently in the article, The Labor of the Inhuman, and makes also a emphatic return in that latest book, Intelligence and Spirit. Brandom belongs to what I understand is the neo-pragmatic school of the University of Pittsburgh. And my inkling is that the interest of the neo-pragmatists to Negarestani lies in their normative functionalism. And the way I have understood that, and what I think are the important points to Negarestani, is, well, one quote that comes from Wilfred Sellars. As you maybe recall from the quick view, you had also one of the interlocutors of Brassier, who says that being human is fraught with odds. And I think that's also encapsulated in Brandom's book title, Saying and Doing. But it is used to set Negarestani's inhuman apart from what I mentioned already earlier, that exaggerated nihilism of the anti-humanism you find in these varying forms of accelerationist thinking. And it is to counter what he calls even the kitsch Marxism, which tends to equate overcoming anthropomorphisms and human arrogance with the negation of the special status of the humans and the capacities of reason. So Negarestani says, inhumanism can actually only emerge once the question what it means to be human is correctly posed. So what is that, this correct understanding of the human? In a few bullet points, again, in the interest of time, it distinguishes sentience as a strong biological and natural category from sapiens as a rational subject. But it recognizes that this is a demarcation that is functional rather than structural, and the continuum is not differentiable everywhere. Being is also not taken in an ontological sense, but perceived as a construct, and it takes special performance in taking shape when it's made visible to other sentient beings. It involves also access to the symbolic and the socio-technological means we have developed as human beings to participate in the construction and revision of norms. And it responds to the demands of an agency, in this instance, reason, which has an interest in, not an interest in preserving the initial self-image of the human. And I think this is central. So the labor of the inhuman, what is the agenda? Well, it wants to elaborate what really what constitutes real human significance. Tries to resist any paradigm that seeks to degrade humanity, either by confronting it with its finitude or by abasing it before the backdrop of the great outdoors. The labor of rational agency on the human is not to be taken in a personal, individual, or even necessarily in a biological sense. And this then opens up what Negarestani calls the inconceivable vistas of intelligence through a collective effort, but at the same time decanting, and I think this is nice for us talking about religious philosophy, decanting the significance of the human from any predetermined meaning or particular import established by theology. I'm going to make a very brief digression here into, first of all, the relation between what Negarestani thinks inhumanism has to do and what redemption theology is all about. It's pretty dismissive of it, because redemption to him is only a theological curiosity, conflating and trivializing the links between past, present, and future. And to act in tandem with that revisionary vector for a future is not to redeem that original self-image of humanity, but to constantly update and revise it in order to reconstitute and modify the significance of being human. As a brief aside, also quickly a thing he said about inhumanism and enlightenment, maybe a bit of a surprising statement. He says one cannot even defend or even speak of inhumanism without also committing to the humanist project through the front door of the Enlightenment. This then brings me to one of the final points in this particular article, and that's the relation between rationality, that normativity, and praxis, which I think I signaled earlier for you. Inhumanism is exactly the activation of the revisionary program of reason against that initial self-portrait of humanity. Rationality is not conducted in accordance with a law, but rather an acknowledging of a law, because he says we do not embrace normative status of things or outright. It usually comes about through an interventive attitudes towards both the revision and construction of norms by way of our social practices. And he says that advance what should be called an augmented rationality, by which he means radicalizing the distinction between what has been done or what has taken place in philosophy, science, and what ought to be done. Definitely a very strong ethical imperative there. It all boils down in this article to constructing the human, in the sense that revising and constructing the human is the very definition of committing to humanity through an interventive attitude that is aimed at unlocking new abilities of saying and doing. That phrase saying and doing occurs repeatedly in that article, the labor of the inhuman. And it has to move in the direction of further singling out the space of reason, differentiating the human from the non-human and sapiens from sentience. Now, let me end with touching very briefly on a few aspects of that book, Intelligence and Spirit. A confession here, I have not yet read that cover to cover. Some things really go over my head, in particular the chapters on formal logic. But I want to just leave you with a few things he says about the how inhumanism contrasts with anti-humanism and also with post-humanism. Aside from Brandon and his book, Between Saying and Doing, another interlocutor who makes an appearance in that book is David Roden, in particular his book, Posthuman Life. And just to recap briefly, it sets off again that book by distinguishing sentience from sapience, sentience being taken as thinking and sapience taken in an ontological sense as being, sentience being formal and sapience being substantive. And then drawing the conclusion from that you should not equate sapient awareness with sentient consciousness. They do not overlap. Because it's only to the extent that we are sapients that we are critically aware of ourselves as sentient beings among other sentients. And to be human is the only way out of being human. Unbinding sentience from sapience cannot go beyond the human. So we are sort of locked up in our humanity. And he also makes the point, and I think this is maybe an interesting discussion point for the next 2 days, in delivering sentience from its so-called sapient yoke, one does not become post-human. Because he says that is still the very idea of a human conservatism that continues to misrepresent the accidental and the locally contingent as necessary and universal. So Negarestani's inhuman is definitely distinct from the anti-humanism of accelerationists and other speculative realists, It's not posthumanism either, even in its speculative, unbounded version of David Rodin's disconnection thesis laid out in that book, Post-Human Life, also something that I have only breezed through and not unpacked fully, but I think it is definitely something to pursue further as I get my head around also that book, Intelligence and Spirit, and also set it separate from conservative humanism, where I repeat again, that still means an endorsement of anthropomorphic time conceptions in philosophy. Always very hard to get my head around. I've struggled with understanding what Bergson meant with it. Meillassoux, Brassier, and also Negarestani have very much engaged with Deleuze's take on time. I've left that all out for reasons of time, but I think some of the answers there in making either a connect or maybe establishing where the disconnect is with more conventional understandings of these Sufi notions you were after, Noreen, it would take a closer reading of these strange time interpretations that, in the case of Brassier and Negarestani, are very much connected with what Deleuze did with it, in repetition and difference, but also in 1,000 plateaus.
Thank you, Carol. We have, I think, time for one more question. Nadia?
Thank you. So I don't think that if my question will be really in tune with the topic you presented, but I suppose in some way it does. So would you, I mean, could you track, or at least have you found any, how would Negarestani connect the natural non-human beings with his idea of inhumane? I mean, if the question is too odd, yeah.
No, it's not an odd question. If you say, you mean other living creatures on this planet? I have seen actually no explicit engagement in that sense. One important distinction, and I didn't make it explicit myself, and that is my feeling. The inhuman does not stand for the inhumane. Far from it, even. I was actually very surprised how the trajectory, having read Cyclonopedia inside out and also the articles he wrote, I saw almost a change in Negarestani from somebody who seemed to be sharing, well, maybe not the outright cynicism of a Nick Land, but Brassier is also, it's a pretty grim and dark picture they paint. But then this ethical twist, especially in a book entitled Intelligence and Spirit, where if you flick through it, there is a lot on formal logic, and these neo-pragmatists, well, they strike me also as crypto-mathematicians, which is where I have to then admit defeat. I never passed a math exam in my life. So I was sort of intimidated by that. And then I saw this emphasis on ethical political praxis, and this mention of the good with a capital G. But there is little engagement indeed with, say, the natural. I mean, there is allusions that there is sentient beings, and probably on a much higher level than we have so far credited all these other living beings for. But I find that a generic recognition than any sense of, maybe that's where your interest lies, any sense of an interest in environmentalism or ecological things. I did not find, it is very cerebral and epistemologically oriented, I think, the work of Negarestani. So maybe he's disappointing to you, Nadia, in that sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. There would be more questions also I would have in mind, but Carol, I will leave it for another occasion. And maybe tomorrow I will talk more about humanism, and I'm very much interested how also Negarestani portrays humanism, because he has this vision of conservative humanism he seems to attack. But let's leave it for now, because we want to give enough space for Leonard. Thank you very much, Carol, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and for responding to the questions. Leonard Schoff. So I would invite Leonard now to start with his talk. The title is The Futurity of God, Interstellar and Quantum Theology. concepts that are not very often put together. I'm really interested. Please, Leonard.
Okay, thanks. I will start sharing my presentation. Is it okay?
Yeah, works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So I will probably continue where Carol somehow stopped. He mentioned, of course, half a joke, but half a real aspect. He mentioned philosophical gods, and I will be discussing some possibilities of humans, of course, being humans and being beyond humans, related to theology. Now, first part will be based in four aspects of futurity of God, and in the second part I will talk a little bit about Christopher Nolan's Interstellar and some theological possibilities that I see in this great movie. And at the end of each section, I will propose one argument. So let me start with the first temporality of the future, the so-called perhaps stage or the initial stage. With Caputo, from his System of God, we could say that perhaps one must always say perhaps for God. There is a future for God, and there is no God except to the degree that some event is possible, which as event exceeds calculation rules, program anticipations, and so forth. God is unrepresentable, but God is the chance of the event and the condition of history. Whenever and whatever there is a chance for the event, that is God, perhaps. God can happen anywhere. This citation is actually taken from Derrida's book, The Force of Law, and Caputo has just replaced the word justice with the word God. And now this is what we have. Now this was the initial stage, but the first stage actually would be John Dewey's Common Fate. This book was actually written somehow to intervene against the early 20th century atheism and the remnants of supernaturalist tendencies alike. But it also includes very interesting citations or thoughts on God related to the idea of the future. The idea of God in Dewey's religious world stands for the unification of ideal values, with imagination intervening into the very core of our beliefs. It is unifying our attitudes and conduct into a signifying whole. So we may say this, quote, that these considerations may be applied to the idea of God or to avoid misleading conceptions to the idea of the divine. This idea is, as I have said, one of ideal possibilities unified through imaginative realization and projection. It is this active relation between ideal and actual to which I would give the main name God. So for Dewey, God actually is an active relation leading to somehow to gathering all ideal possibilities of our values, of our cultural endeavors and so on. And in the mathematical terms, it could be called as the limit of all our endeavors. Technological, of course, era has not yet come in this year in a way that we are acquainted with this today, but of course it can be included into this concept. Now my second temporality is related to Raymond Rouyer, very important but somehow not so much represented scholar from the 20th century. Raymond Rouyer influenced Deleuze, for example, and many other thinkers, and he published largely on topics such as philosophy, biology, nature. He contributed to early cybernetics, technology, information science at the very beginning of the era of robotics in the 40s. But equally importantly, part of his work was the religious aspect of his thought, with his original conceptions of the Tao God or the unknown God. And we'll look closely to his essay, The Status of the Future and the Visible World, in which he presents us with the idiosyncratic account of God, time, matter, and consciousness of the world. Now, I would just like to pay tribute to a book in which Rouyer is presented in the chapter Rouyer and Embryogenesis of the World. This is Elizabeth Gross's book, The Incorporeal, and it's a great book and a great contribution to his philosophical talk, but also with some, of course, theological consequences included. Now, in Ruer's thinking of the divine, the future itself may be the destination. He writes, quote, "When we imagine, our imagination depends especially on our memory, but there is also a tiny proportion of creativity, of something pulled from nothing. We will understand this difference of creativity as it were, a quantum moment in theology later. The growth arising from our creativity and all of its visible consequences is not all that we have. There exists, and this is really important contribution of Ruer, the invisible world or the unknown God, which is like an immense body of underground water under a certain pressure. This underground water, as a reservoir of memories or of the so-called mnemic themes, is available to us only as long as we are able to communicate on our own account with those layers of these supplies of water which are positioned more closely to the surface. We must make our own future, but nothing can be made without conforming to an order existing well beyond our own wills." Now this invisible world, this underground water, this reservoir called somehow divinity or God, could be understood as a quantum vacuum, as it were, in contemporary science, and we will come to this aspect a little bit later. Now, directly go to Ruer's essay, The Status of the Future and the Visible World from 1980, the quote would be as follows: "God, if we hold to this world, is the future itself, or rather the eternal reservoir beyond time and creating time, who constantly projects himself or pours himself into the present and who transforms the functioning of already created beings into sensible behavior." So this projecting into the present, this future itself aspect of God, this will be extremely important for my interpretation of Interstellar and the plot of this movie, and some theological consequences as well. Now, we have, if I continue with this quote, "God, or the future as ideal control, can only produce minute shifts in direction. His ideas steer and guide through ultra-weak interactions. Nevertheless, the universe finally obeys this imperceptible future, but not without enormous failures and catastrophes." End of quote. So, briefly, Dewey's God is revealed mainly through our imaginative, philosophical, as it were, realization and projections into the future. It's not so much operating from the future, but only as a way of providing sense to our strivings and doings, as humanity, of course. But Ruer's God, on the other hand, is actually more linked to the very concept of time and temporality of the future itself. It is situated beyond time and actually creates time on its own behalf. Now, there is the third step needed, and I call it third and perhaps an unexpected step. It is my inspiration for this step comes from Mormonism, from Mormon theology. Namely, its main message consists of an idea that we have to learn how to become God. So it is oriented towards the future, of course. And that we indeed have inherited the very same power and glory as God to become exalted like him or her. Because there is also a mother side of the God in Mormonism. We therefore can arrive at the stations, as it were, of God, but this can only happen in the future. But incarnation is a two-way street, and a part of each of us that we usually call spirit is in fact co-equal with God. So Mormon theology remains open to the future and reveals as a truly post-Christian message to us. Human deification or apotheosis represents perhaps the most significant part of the teaching of Mormonism. Douglas Davis says, "We are spirit persons like Jesus was. He's over our elder brother, who is further alongside the path of divine development." And very important is that also the Menki for gods in Mormonism, the aspiring towards the future as our final destination in achieving godhood, means that there is a capacity in or for us for being a part of the process in which we may indeed become gods. And additionally, as argued by Lincoln Cannon in his essay, science and technology are among the means prescribed by God. Now, as a second part of this third temporal somehow reflection, this is a quote from Joseph Smith, founder of Mormonism, from his last testimony, the so-called The King Follett discourse from 1844. He says, "God himself, who sits enthroned in under heaven, is a man like one of you. That is the great secret. Here then is eternal life, to know the only wise and true God. And you have got to learn how to be gods yourselves, to be kings and priests to God, the same as all gods have done, by going from a small degree to another, from grace to grace, from exaltation to exaltation, until you are able to sit in glory, as do those who sit enthroned in everlasting power. And finally, God never did have power to create the spirit of man at all. God himself could not create himself. Intelligence exists upon a self-existent principle. It is a spirit from age to age, and there is no creation about it. So this is a very important aspect. And one of the most famous statements from Mormonism is the following statement: as man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. And a very important aspect of Mormon theology is that materialism is very much present throughout this theology. God and Son have tangible bodies. Holy Ghost is more purely spiritual, but still is consisted of a subtly material elements. Now, I will somehow risk, so to say, my first attempt of an argument. God is the future itself, of course, based on my 4 temporalities so far. God is the future itself, revealing in a series of revelations through time to other beings as not yet gods or evolving gods. God evolved from the most archaic and still not fully disclosed matter in a time moment still not known to us human beings. What stands behind, below, or before all existence in an ungrounded abyssal ground or an immense body of underground water or quantum vacuum? God stands as a fully, also technologically evolved supreme or super intelligent being, reaching towards us by projecting into the present. In this process, which is mediated to us through visible signs, called also miracles, God enlightens and transforms the functionings of the primary forms and secondary composite beings, such as elements, minerals, plants, animals, various homo species, superhuman beings, also, of course, including intelligence, computers, AI, by causing human beings and beings beyond our reach to evolve into an ever more agapeistically developed species. So this is for the first part. Now the second part, which is a bit shorter, so that I will wind up within 20 minutes, is dedicated to Christopher Nolan's Interstellar from 2014. Nolan's Interstellar represents one of the most original possibilities for imagining the futurity of God on the background of time travel, quantum physics, and post-apocalyptic thinking. We know that since the beginning of cinematic history, time has played or features one of the most central roles for imagining alternative visions of life. We may only mention the 3 famous films by Christopher Nolan, Memento, Inception, and most recently Tenet. But in Interstellar, although there is no mention of God or divinity, but still all of the main elements of this film hint at a profound level of thinking which could imply more than an imaginary journey into the cinematically arranged future. From Murphy's ghost, manipulation of time and matter, and quantum dimensions of a space-time continuum, all the way to 5-dimensional bulk beings, God perhaps, and a special device, tesseract, hypercube. All these elements indicate Nolan's rich theological intuitions. Now I would like to pay another tribute, this time to Kip Thorne. He's a Nobel Prize laureate from 2015, I think, and he cooperated with Christopher Nolan by writing this screenplay, and he was one of the main advisors, of course, or actually the main advisor to his movie. Kip Thorne, The Science of Interstellar. Now, let us move to quantum, so-called quantum moment in theology, or so-called difference sent from the future. One of the most original ideas of this film is that humanity lives in a 5-dimensional bulk. This is a kind of a mass or voluminosity, or kind of a hyperspace, inhabited by hyperspherical or 5-dimensional beings. Upon the impending catastrophe, it is an environmental catastrophe, kind of a post-Anthropocene film is this. It is these beings that help the inhabitants of the Earth to survive by populating new worlds in the universe. But who are these beings? In Interstellar, these beings are referred to as they, and nobody knows who they were. They are just referred to as with this reverential they. According to Nolan's imagination, these beings are actually our descendants, humans who in the far future technologically evolved to acquire an additional space dimension and live in the bulk now. So we may be reminded both to rulers and to Mormonism in this place. It might thus be so that these beings exist. If they do, and if they pass through our worlds, we could be affected by their gravity. If I quote from Kip Thorne, for example, if a hyperspherical being appears in my stomach and has a strong enough gravitational pull, my stomach may begin to cramp as my muscles tighten, trying to resist getting sucked to the center of the being's spherical cross-section. Of course, within the classical theology, or maybe in Schopenhauer, this element or this moment would be designated with the word grace, of course. Now we have kind of a quantum moment already presented discretely in Interstellar. And it is precisely from here that our theological imagination could derive an entirely new acceleration. So my hypothesis would kind of be that the universe as a membrane, called brain by the physicist, officially of course in science, is residing in a higher dimensional hyperspace to which the physicists give the name bulk. The scientists do not yet know if the bulk or hyperspace really exists, but the recent announcement of a superstring theory demanding already that apart from our three-dimensional membrane, there must exist a kind of a multidimensional bulk. And then analogously to the mysterious or scientifically still undisclosed relationality of brain and bulk, we also do not know yet about the dark matter and so forth and so on. The same relationality appears between two temporal moments, and we are now on a plane of theology. Our time as human beings must be related in a yet unknown manner to the temporality of a God, kind of a future temporality of a God, which as it were interferes with our ordinary worlds through the effects that we learn to call miracles. In an analogous manner, it might now be so that this God exists as a supreme bulk being per analogiam. If it does, and if it somehow mysteriously passes through our worlds, we could be affected by this gravity, as it were, in ways we do not yet know to apprehend or describe. God, which is the future itself, Ruyer, messages as a superhumanly technologically evolved being, perhaps, into the past. The tesseract from the Interstellar could thus represent the cosmic vehicle of hint at God's supreme love for humanity and nature as well. Now, I don't have so much time, of course, to go into more detail. Of course, I'm also not a physicist, but still, one of the representations for this passing through our bodies is this depiction of a 2D and 3D representation of such an event. Of course, within the universe and within the quantum physics, this was then appear within the 3D and 5D relationality, which is much, much more difficult to depict and to represent. So this three-dimensional bulk being a sphere will pass through our brain. And so if we are somehow this square, if a human being is this flat square, a 2D square, then we would first see a very distant, a small blue point appearing and somehow approaching us. Then it would expand and somehow it would pass through our brain without somehow that we would be able to see it, or we would just feel it, or we would just have a certain feel of a gravity in our stomach. And then it would again disappear. And on the other hand, from the right side, we see how this would appear in a 2D and 3D depiction. This is, of course, only a kind of a attempt of a representation of this event, and it's based on Edwin Abbott's satirical novella titled Flatland, a Romance of Many Dimensions from 1844, and both Christopher Nolan and Kip Thorne were very much inspired by this novel. Then this is then Tesseract, multi-cube, specially designed for this Interstellar, which represents kind of a quantum time by which we can send our message back into the past, and Tesseract would somehow be able to represent in this way these evolving humans or superhumans who somehow help us by messaging into the past. And finally, the argument now in the second, perhaps final attempt, of course not yet, on the background of the existence of brain beings and objects, God exists as a supreme bulk being. God passes through our worlds, which are affected by this gravity in ways we do not yet know how to apprehend or scientifically describe. As an enhanced spiritual material quantum being, God subtly passes through the surface of brain beings, which report these weak passings as mystical experiences. The interactions of God with brain beings establish weak correspondences between brain beings and God or deities. Now with Caputo, God can happen anywhere. And I would like to wind up this talk with the world is full of gods. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for this talk. You have sort of fed us high carbon diet of very much packed with both scientific or there is a glance towards the scientific discourse and of course theological discourse, and I think this is a very interesting field for us to ask questions on. So I would like to open now for questions, and let's try to finish the questions something like 3:20, and then we will start slightly later. We will have like a 10-minute break, if you allow me, that we will shorten our break for 5 minutes also, just to bring the time closer. So are there any questions, please? Yes, John, please.
That was wonderful, Leonard. Thank you very much. I can't do it justice, but I just have a comment and a fact. The fact is that Kip Thorne was actually raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Though he's currently an atheist, he was embedded in Mormon theology as a youth growing up. So that's an interesting fact.
Really, I didn't know that. Thanks for this,
The second thing I just wondered about, man, is so fascinated by the connection of descendants, past and present. And Joseph Smith's temple theology, he thinks of the temple as a kind of spaceship or a time ship, which allows the family of the earth to be bound together through holy ordinances. And I'm just wondering if that has any resonance with your notion of the futurity of God or the Tesseract.
Yeah, I think that I noticed somewhere this, analogy, but I forgot it. So thanks for reminding me of this metaphor, or maybe more than a metaphor, of a spaceship. Of course it is, because in my opinion, Dewey, of course, is not so close to this constellation. He just helped me to somehow start with many years ago. Also, my relationship to Richard Rorty, who was also very close to Mormonism because his wife is a Mormon. So this is a really interesting constellation. But from Ruyer and Mormonism, we can really find fascinating ways, towards this I would say, apocalyptic and also post-Christian thinking, and also somehow post-scientific thinking, because, we must enter this dialogue with science, with AI, with technology, and we must equally be able, to discuss these topics as theologians, as scientists are. It is very sad that then sometimes, scientists would somehow take this, would be only allowed to talk about, quantum moments in our lives and in our experiences. So certainly I will, in my future essays, I will certainly try to develop this thought even more in direction of Joseph Smith metaphor of a spaceship, and direct our churches, not only Mormon and Catholic one, to which I somehow weakly belong in a sense of Gianni Vattimo, towards an enhanced, so to say, theology, being able to discuss all these topics, that scientists are discussing today, also within theology. And really thanks for this, both comments.
Thank you, John. Todd has a question, please.
Well, it's maybe a reflection. I'm not sure it's a question. I was struck by the shift between Dewey and then, is it Royer in the second figure? And it seemed to me that I haven't read much Dewey, but a lot of thinkers of that generation, I think, approached the future as a kind of anthropological part of human nature, almost. That there's, or part of the human experience, that the unknown God, the future, these are just reflections of the human experience of time. And so God, I don't know that some of them believed in God per se, but they just said, well, I know where God comes from. It comes from this anthropological element of human nature, such as, in Ernst Bloch, it's the noch nicht, right? The not yet. So they try to reduce it to this sort of simple idea of the negation of the present, that is the future. Or Kolakowski, in the 60s was interested in defining the left as negation of the present. So all leftists are those who negate the present. So these kind of ways of thinking about the future, and God as a kind of placeholder for that element of human nature that can't know. And it's also the source of utopia, of course. But I thought it was very interesting that your move to say, well, what if we take that future unknown and give it a subjectivity, which seemed to be what you're doing with your speculations there on the bulk God. So I thought that was a very interesting move, because it seemed like you were, there's the same way, like sort of there's a kind of Feuerbachian element to what Dewey was saying, for my money, that this idea of a realization that there are projections from human nature, and that we have to account for these projections of human nature when we try to explain religion. And you've turned that around again and said,
maybe,
well, those projections have subjectivity.
As a Feuerbachian myself, I would say that it's not so much in projection than in a relationship to Feuerbachian elemental, theology, as it were. Okay, this would be but as a move from Dewey to Royer and beyond, I would say that the key word would be imagination. Imagination. So I would not so much be somehow obsessed with any kind of theology, because we know that Dewey was, according to Rorty, he was a still once born soul, he's called it, okay? So he was not operating within a pristine theological atmosphere, so to say. We know that. But still, I was always taking this book, this tiny book, A Common Hate, very seriously, because of this immense power of this, immense theological power of this imaginative possibility of projecting our most, I would say, deep or ethical, theological thought into the kind of projecting into the future and bringing, some more possibility to imagine better worlds and new worlds into our present. So in this, I would say, movement, I think that Dewey offers enough, I would say, theological imagination and feed us with enough theology. But, I hope that somehow you're satisfied with this answer.
Can I just add one more question that has appeared on Facebook? It is from Reza Akbari, Professor Akbari from Iran, philosopher whom you know, Leonard. He wrote this. I don't know Hegel's philosophy very well, but it seems to me that we can see some of his philosophical ideas in a modern physical framework or physics framework. Am I right? So I want to know whether you are under the influence of Hegel's philosophy in your idea in this lecture of futurity of God or not? What is its relation to Hegel?
I would more relate Hegel to maybe in some environmental things, Of course, there are many Hegels, but one of those could be, related in this kind of synchronistic reading, in the reading of, cosmic reading. We would relate Hegel to modern cosmology and maybe to modern physics in this way, but I'm not specialist in Hegel, of course. But certainly I was not influenced by Hegel in whatsoever way, you know. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonard. So I suggest we make a break now. I hope we are back. Hello, Nadia.
Yeah.
So we will start very soon with the next talk. This talk is by Nadia Forlan-Stante, and it's titled Artificial Intelligence, Transhumanism, the Challenge of Christian Ecofeminism. Nadia, off you go.
Thank you. I hope that you will forgive me. I usually don't like to have PowerPoint presentations, but I adore to watch them. So very selfishly, I haven't prepared one, but I would like to actually go into a few details within the article. Actually, is still the work in progress, but still, I would like to talk about the comparison. I will compare Christian ecofeminist ethics of relationality in terms of interconnectedness of all beings, human and non-human, natural human and non-human beings in the web of life, in terms of interconnected subjectivity, to transhumanist ethics of human enhancement and technological singularity. And then further on, I will try to expose a critique of transhumanism and its possible misuse of technological power over human and nature from the lenses of Christian ecofeminism, since new superintelligence could derive accelerating technological progress, leaving ecofeminist, ecocentric egalitarianism behind, while driving toward posthumanism as its final goal. So the reality of ecological crisis on one hand, and the quantum leap in technological growth, we could say, and development on the other, leave very strong imprint on human being, who is at the same time co-creator of both, and consequently is also being co-shaped by both. So just as the Neolithic revolution had a strong impact on the so-called psychopsychological development of human beings and their interpersonal and interspecies relations, and in relation to natural non-human beings, so the technological revolution brings about strong changes in human beings. So from this standpoint, in this context, the popularity of transhumanism is growing on the one hand, and the need for an ecofeminist paradigm on the other at the same time is very, very much present as well. So although these two paradigms seem completely different, like we could say that they almost could be described as two completely different galaxies, and also very incompatible at first sight, some commonalities could be pointed out. Well, Joe Thompson states that transhumanism actually promotes transhumanism promises us freedom from the biological limitations inherent in our nature. It aims to enhance physical, emotional, and cognitive capacities, thus opening up new possibilities and horizons of experience. He also claims that many transhumanist aspirations resemble those within the domain of religion. So in this presentation, I will try to make the comparison. I will compare Christian ecofeminist ethics with the transhumanist one. And let me start with the conceptual outline of Christian ecofeminist ethics with the words of Heather Eaton. She states that stepping back from the so-called mirrorite issues and assessments, the impulse for gender justice is not only a social political movement and an ethical transformation. Feminism, along with gender or sexual diversity project, represents a historical revolution of consciousness, arguably the largest shift of consciousness since Neolithic revolution. So the end of quote of Heather Eden. In the core of Christian ecofeminist thought lies actually the very same idea of metanoia, so the change of consciousness in relation to human nature relations. This transformation, this is actually viewed in terms of transformation of negative stereotypes which restore any kind of domination in so-called ecocentric egalitarianism, and it seems to be, which seems to be the next step of the evolution of human beings and non-human relationships in the web of life for ecofeminists, especially for Christian ecofeminist perceptions. And being in relation, according to much of ecofeminist theology, is in the first place an ethical activity. Here, the core of ecofeminist ethics of relationality, in terms of interconnectedness of all beings in the web of life, plays a part. So what is the web of life? The web of life is actually a quite widespread metaphor originating in ecofeminism and poetically denoting the dynamics of the collective feminine view of a world of interconnected subjectivities. So Rosamund Redford Ruder, one of the pioneers of Christian ecofeminism, understands ecological interdependence in the sense of a life-giving web as a pantheistic or transcendentally immanent web of life. This common source, in her opinion, fuels and maintains a continual renewal of the natural life circle, and at the same time allows and binds us to fight the exploitative forms of hierarchical relationships and strive for the establishment of renewed relations of mutual acknowledgement. So relationality emerges as a key concept in ecofeminist theology and particularly ecofeminist ethics. It includes, as we've heard, the concepts of interdependence and mutuality. And ecocentric egalitarianism actually comes into play here. And ecocentric egalitarianism includes all humans as well as natural non-humans. Ecofeminists actually insist on the intimate connections between the domination of women and the other forms of dominations with the domination over nature. The awareness of this fundamental interconnectedness of all the consequent interdependence and joint responsibility in the ethical moral sense for ecofeminists therefore represents the next step in the evolution of humanity as such. So if we now conclude with this really quick outline with Christian ecofeminist perception or the core understanding of the way of life and the connections between human beings and non-human, natural non-human inhabitants. We could say that all types of theological ecofeminism, speaking of Christian theological ecofeminism, actually strive for a deconstruction of the patriarchal paradigm, its hierarchical structure, methodology, and thought. And they try to deconstruct actually the entire paradigm of men's supremacy over women, of mind over body, heaven over earth, of the transcendent over the immanent, of the male god alienated and ruling over the creation, and replace all this with new alternatives or with new meta-narratives. The Christian tradition, for instance, has contributed several, of course, from the point of view, from the ecofeminist point of view, contributed several problematic images and symbols that have consolidated and survived in form of stereotypes and prejudice and taken root in the legacy of the Western philosophical religious thought. So ecofeminist Christian theologies seek to revive the lost images and the symbols of understanding of the universe as the body of God. For example, Sally McFaul, Rosamund Redford Ruder, and others. So this used to be a typical metaphor, actually, and the focal image of the sensibility of the Western Mediterranean world, but was replaced by a mechanic worldview model in 17th century. So Vandana Shiva and Carol Merchant actually talks, they revealed this idea. So now we will make a move and just briefly describe a conceptual outline of transhumanist ethics. So what is the core of so-called transhumanist ethics? Transhumanism and posthumanism are actually two related philosophical movements tied closely to the premises of technology. So posthumanism argues that there is a next stage in human evolution. In this stage, humans will become posthuman because of our interactions with and connection to technology. So transhumanism, on the other hand, promotes values that contribute to this change. Transhumanism aims at posthumanism, both are based to a large degree on the potential offered by technology. In a way, transhumanism provides the thinking and method for moving toward posthumanism. So transhumanism leads to posthumanism in a way. They share a common value system. And in this paper, in this presentation, I'll actually refer mostly to transhumanism, but also occasionally to posthumanism because of this connection. And Dorcas Cheng Tuzun describes defines actually transhumanism as a faith in technology to vastly expand the capabilities of humans. Transhumanism as such rejects the so-called supernatural, actually, though notes of transcendence echo throughout, we could say. Instead, transhumanism emphasizes that we discover meaning and ethics via reason, progress, and the value of existence itself. First, transhumanism actually emphasizes perpetual progress. Transhumanists always want more intelligence, more life, more experience, and this desire occurs on the intellectual level through the second principle, self-transformation, which means affirming continual ethical, intellectual, and physical self-improvement through critical and creative thinking, perpetual learning, personal responsibility, experimentation, etc. So many humanist visionaries have focused primarily on technology for obvious reasons. One important goal has been the development of greater human intelligence and a forecast about the arrival of superintelligent artificial intelligence. So this superintelligence could actually drive accelerating technological progress, leaving humans behind. Scholars refer to this idea as the singularity. So, however, the singularity is not absolutely vital to all forms of transhumanism. So, in this way, the movement of transhumanism, we could say, problematizes the current understanding of human, not necessarily through its past and present legacies, but through the possibilities inscribed within its possible biological and technological revolutions. And human enhancement is actually a crucial notion to the transhumanist reflection. The many keys to access such a goal are identified in science and technology in all of their variables as existing, emerging, and speculative forms, from regenerative medicine to nanotechnology, radical life extension, mind uploading, and so-called cryonics. So the practice that, and then again, among other fields. So but we have to actually put forth here the notion that actually distinctive currents coexist in transhumanism, such as we know so-called libertarian humanism, democratic humanism, extropianism, etc., etc. So in this way, I would like to actually stop here with this quick outline so that we remember what actually is the core of the transhumanist ethics. Now let's move and try to put forward some commonalities or between Christian ecofeminist ethics and transhumanist one. So while we try to draw some of these commonalities, we must consider their respective breadth. Since nor Christian ecofeminism nor transhumanism are anything but a monolithic phenomenon, they both certain variety of different distinctive currents and forms, and therefore it's perhaps clumsy to talk of either of them in singular. So speaking about ethics, there are some crucial commonalities within different forms of Christian ecofeminism, as well as within different forms of transhumanism. And as of what Christian ecofeminism and transhumanism are, I will define them as the following. So Christian ecofeminism is a form of religious or rather theological environmental theory and a form of feminist theology that stays within Christian thought. It is considered by the oppression of women and the oppression of nature, whereas transhumanism is concerned with materiality in the broadest sense, as we are already immersed in a physical world, surrounded and constituted by matter. On one hand, Christian ecofeminism actually links the oppression of women, animals, and nature as symbolically, structurally, and politically similar, because embodiment and nature have been exploited as a rich source for images of otherness, we could say. Now let's take a closer look to the first commonality. That would be a part of this respective interdisciplinary, not non-monolithic understanding of both is actually their respective interdisciplinarity. Heather Eaton compares this wide diversity of ecofeminisms to an intersection point of multiple pathways. For, as she says, people come to ecofeminism from many directions and have taken it to other places, disciplines, and actions. And then, therefore, ecofeminism is actually not just not monolithical phenomenon, but also very interdisciplinary. And so what I want to say quickly is that actually, like many forms, different forms of transhumanism exist, which I have described them before, also lots of different types of ecofeminisms exist also within religious realm, right? But it seems that the greatest dissent among them was actually caused by the question of the woman-nature connection, or better, the question whether the woman is closer to nature than man due to her ability to bear life, which actually leads to essentialism. Now, if we stop at that point and transfer to transhumanism, Brostam actually states that transhumanism also promotes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding and evaluating the opportunities of enhancing the human condition, and the human organism opened by the advancement of technology. So attention is given to both present technologies like genetic engineering and information technology, and also anticipated future ones such as molecular nanotechnology and artificial intelligence. So they are both commonalities, they are both very interdisciplinary, though they tackle different angle. Now, the second commonality would be anti-dualism as a common goal. But the path is different. So let me bring Rosemary Redford Ruder again, the pioneer of Christian ecofeminism, we could say. She lent the first ecofeminist voice actually within Christianity in 1972. So through her eyes through the eyes of theology of liberation, or more precisely from a feminist somatic and ecological perspective, she called attention to the basic dualisms, the origin of which she ascribed to the apocalyptic Platonic regional legacy of so-called classical Christianity. And this negative, these binarisms, or better say dualisms, include the alienation of the mind from the body, of the subjective self from the objective world, the subjective withdrawal and alienation of the individual from the wider human and social network. So the domination of the spirit over nature. I see that I have lost the track of the time, but I will move towards the end. If we also, if we switch to transhumanism, is actually also the so-called urge to actually overcome anti-dualisms in terms of, let's say, I would like to bring Donna Haraway's Cyborg in her dismantling of strict dualisms and boundaries here, such as the one between human and non-human animals, biological organisms and machines, the physical and the non-physical realm, and ultimately the boundary between technology and the self. So again, now I would like to close actually with the tensions or the differences between Christian ecofeminism, metanoia, and transhumanist human enhancement. So in the core of Christian ecofeminist thought, as we've heard, lies the idea or ideal of metanoia, the change of consciousness in relation to human nature relations, right? And for most representatives of Christian ecofeminism, this means also a thorough study of the construction and criticism of androcentric models of theology, particularly in relations to the images of God and his relationship with the entire cosmos. But still, metanoia as such represents the change of consciousness in the change of the way one things, resulting from the, we could say, change of spiritual conversion, therefore a complete change of heart. We, from what we have heard previously, transhumanism actually rejects supernatural instead of that, transhumanism emphasizes that we discover meaning and ethics via reason, progress, and value of existence in self. So perpetual progress, self-transformation, human enhancement, which is crucial notion to transhumanist reflections in terms of progress through and with technology. Now, I will conclude now because I've lost the track of the time. I also have the essentialism versus any essentialism, because the critics that some of the thinkers of new materialism and transhumanism have put forward, especially Donna Haraway and Bredotti, are actually that ecofeminisms are linked towards essentialism, which actually for Christian ecofeminist theology of Rosemary Redford Ruder wouldn't stand. At least she states so. And let me conclude with the major departure between Christian ecofeminism and transhumanism are actually despite the notion of nature, also the technology, understanding of the meaning of technology. We've heard that actually technology is crucial for the transformation for transhumanists, while actually for ecofeminism, actually partakes in suspicion against technology, arguing that it further separates us from natural ways of knowing and interacting with nature. Sorry, I have spent my time, and I will stop here, and maybe I could, sorry, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. Thank you for your talk, for also bringing in a topic that was not mentioned before. It is, feminist and eco-feminist thought, and also in Christian theology. I maybe have a short question myself, and then I will ask whether somebody else has a question, but we'll need to be short. So one question I have, Nadia, is about the sort of, you mentioned Donna Haraway, so post-humanist thinkers who are also come from feminist influence have been critical of ecofeminism, right? So you have mentioned that yourself. And you said that Rosemary Radford Rutter is not guilty of essentialism. Now, I would still maybe press you further on this and say, isn't ecofeminism a Christian or not, in certain danger of romanticizing certain kind of pre-technological state of affairs, or which almost like something that has never existed, because technology in a way is with us for thousands and thousands of years. It is, now we are not only now we are using it, but we have been using it in old technology before digital technology has really deeply changed what does it mean to be human being, what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean for us to connect with also natural world. Technology has sort of mediated in quite deep ways already for centuries. So in some sense, there is almost a danger here to, brand technology as something new and something that came from outside, destroying our relationship with nature, which I kind of sense sometimes in ecofeminist discourse. What would you say to that?
Yes, thank you very much. That's exactly the point that I wanted to bring forward, actually, in my further elaboration, that actually the ecofeminism as such, not just Christian ecofeminism, but the majority of ecofeminisms, they actually claim to actually be not they don't all exclude technology, but they all have in common that humanism and the humanism in terms of human being in the ecosystem of so-called ecofeminist egalitarianism. And that's very poetical, that's an ideal, but also from my point of view, also the transhumanism offers so-called ideal solution for the world, right? And for the human species as such. But still, for example, there are also Rosemary Radford Rutter or Anne Primavesi or other Christian ecofeminists. They don't exclude technology from their very beginnings in a way, but they are suspicious about artificial intelligence going on too strong without actually noticing its from where it was actually made, the originality of the co-creator. So there the Christianity comes into play, which actually, so that's the basic stuff that actually, but I completely agree. I just wanted to, I won't elaborate anymore because I would have to give you all the argumentations also, but what I lack is the answers from, for example, Christian ecofeminists, contemporary ones. I haven't noticed their answers to Donna Haraway or Rossi Bridotti. So there isn't really a dialogue or even a connection. They don't even try to connect to the transhumanist thought, let's say, or post-humanist thought.
Yeah, I wanted to say that these are distinguishing themselves from transhumanism, Bridotti and Hales and Haraway. But thank you, Nadia. I would probably, if there is a burning question, very short one, we can do, but otherwise we would have to move on. to our next speaker, with whom we will have a conversation. I'm just wanted to check first whether Konstantin is already here. Hello, Konstantin. Good to see you. Okay, so we will move on now. So Konstantin Sandis, you join us from the UK, is that right?
That's right.
Konstantin is a lecturer of philosophy at University of Hertfordshire, and also, as we see, a cat lover. And those who know his Instagram or other accounts know that there are several cats around there that know some philosophy. We could notice. And also, you have been a visiting researcher with Microsoft Research in Cambridge, which is probably the biggest Microsoft research lab, right, in Europe, if I'm not mistaken. Hello to you, Konstantin.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you here. Can I start with the question first, very broad question, and that is, how does a philosopher of action, a Wittgenstein scholar, a Hume scholar also, who does not have a long-standing history in, computer science or information technology or philosophy information, for example, become a visiting researcher at such an institution as Microsoft Research Lab? Maybe in first, when we hear this, people might be surprised.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question, a good question. Hopefully not too good a question, but it kind of took me by surprise as well. Like you said, I mainly work on philosophy of action and also action explanation, and it's actually really the explanation bit that has turned out to be particularly crucial. But what the kind of things I'm doing now related to AI with people at Microsoft and other people have less to do with how I originally came to be involved, especially with the Cambridge lab. So my first book was called The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, and it offered, among other things, a kind of pluralistic account of reasons for action on a number of levels. But on one kind of basic level, the pluralism was just that there are a lot of theories, not so much in philosophy actually, but in evolutionary psychology and other places, that try to reduce human motivation to one underlying drive or motive or reason, sex, death, whatever. And there was someone at Microsoft who picked up on this because people interested in information communication technology tended to have a kind of monistic account of why we communicate. And the idea, and the clue is kind of in the name, the idea was that we communicate in order to exchange information. And this person, Richard Harper, whose background is in social science and ethnomethodology, thought that there was something limited. It's not that we don't communicate to exchange information, but if you think this is the only reason for communicating, it will limit the kind of technology you create, because what will count as good technology will be purely a matter of how much information does it get across and how fast, or something like that. And so he got interested in this idea of pluralism in relation to the reasons why we might communicate and how this might expand the range of things we're looking at when we're designing or researching into design for ICTs. And so I first joined Microsoft with a project, with a scholarship for a PhD student who we co-supervised together. Her name was Katja Behrens, and she wrote a very interesting thesis on this kind of stuff. But that was a long time ago now, and one thing leads to another. Microsoft, especially when I first sort of came to the lab, had a very blue skies thinking. So there was a lot of anything you're curious about, you could, and really you know, having tried various things, what I'm really doing now is working on AI intelligibility and also the right to explanation. And that's a very different thing. It relates to explanation, of course. So the background in action explanation is still there, but it's a very different question from what I began with.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to your current work on AI and right to explanation. But maybe just, can you tell us, because some of us maybe don't, you know, haven't read philosophy of action or don't even recognize it as a particular subfield of philosophy, because in a way, as it was named as such, it's not such a long, you know, it's not maybe it's a relatively young field of philosophy, so to say, although of course philosophical reflection, questions on action are very old questions. So if you can, with a few words, tell us what is philosophy of action? How can we even, you know, where should we put it in our understanding of philosophy?
Yes, thank you. And I think you're right to also suggest that the name can be a bit misleading. I think if you know nothing about it and you hear it, you might think political action, social action, call to arms, and that kind of thing. And I think actually there is a tiny bit of philosophy of action that does relate to those kind of things. So they're not a million miles away, but it's not what we within the field traditionally think of as philosophy of action. And you're right that those questions, they're there in the history of philosophy. In the history of philosophy, they tend to be tied with questions about responsibility, so ethical questions to do with free will, responsibility, and there was a long tradition of thinking that if an action is voluntary, then I might be responsible for it, and so on. But in this kind of new guise, and new is sort of post-Wittgenstein, I suppose, there are sort of two main, I mean, this is really crude, but I would say two main branches of it. One is about what actions are, a sort of ontological question about how an agency and how they come about and how bodily movements relate to action and what it is to act. So there's a kind of range of questions there from are actions events, and if so, are they different from other events or are they not events at all? And then there's another question, which of course is not unrelated, which is about the explanation of action, about human and indeed other animal motivation, why we act, reasons for action, and then the kind of the nature of what is a reason for action and how does the reason relate to the action.
Sure.
And I think of these things as coming very close to what used to be called philosophy of psychology, but I think now this term really means something closer to philosophy of cognitive science or something like that. But in a way, it's what Anscombe called philosophical psychology or something.
Yeah, sure. In the old way, we might say.
In the old way.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. So, for example, when you say two different things, you know, nature of action and, you know, relation to behavior and in a way meanings of these concepts that are so often used, but you know, from your book that you mentioned, the things we do and why we do them, one thing that you point out is that the confusion and conflations of the meanings of these terms is in different fields of science, you know, that use them, is one of the biggest problems, really, to talk clearly about it and to have an interdisciplinary conversation about them. And I've almost felt, I haven't actually read the entirety of your book, but I plan to. But I would like to ask you, I felt a certain pessimism almost, and one might say maybe it's a bit, you know, is it the Wittgensteinian pessimism that there are just multiple ways of using of this concepts, and that kind of disables clearer, you know, let's say strong theories of action and this kind of clear-cut explanations of action that some people really want to have or simply assume there must be, and then ask for causes of action or reasons for action in a quite simple way. So would you say it's a slightly pessimistic position that you are presenting, or am I misreading you?
No, you're not misreading. I suppose whether it's optimistic or pessimistic depends on what one wants from a philosophy of action. So, and you put it very well, I thought. So if one wants to read a book about action, to come out thinking, now I know why we do the things we do. And I do start the book sort of saying, reader beware. If that's what you want, you may have come to the wrong place. So in that sense, yeah. I'm pessimistic, but I'm not pessimistic because this is an unknowable truth or anything like that. It's rather that we need to get clear first on what kind of question we're asking and what sort of answer we're looking for. And the conflations arise when an answer about what motivates human behavior you might be looking for a very different answer from when you ask, what are the kinds of things that I weigh when I'm deliberating about what to do? And whatever I do in that case may be very different from whatever drives are at work. So the kind of optimistic side of it was that I think, in a way, I'm interested in action, not philosophy of action, and this includes psychology, physiology, and all sorts of neuroscience and so on. But in order to become interdisciplinary and bring these fields together, we just have to accept that there are these challenges, and each of these disciplines has its own sets and subsets of jargon as well. And so what I was trying to do was a kind of prolegomena, to sort of try and walk through these to sort of see how can we come to have something that's more unified, where we say, well, this is a physiological question, this is a conceptual question, this is an empirical question.
Yeah. And does this, and this is a slight sub question before we go a little bit to AI, and question maybe on human nature, which also you kind of mention in broad strokes in that book. So does that speak to the traditional problem, whether it's more we should think of causes, materialist, external causes for action, and reason, more internalist? How does the picture you are getting at in the book or in your theory more generally speak to this old, let's say, old question, whether we should focus on reasons or on causes?
It's an old question, and it kind of grew out of, you used to find this question in philosophy of history. It used to be a very big thing about the nature of, as you know, Hempel, Dre, the nature of historical explanation. And I, in a way, I'm sort of, in some way, between these two camps and not pleasing either of them. But officially, and certainly for a very long time, I was in the non-causalist camp. So that there's a certain, and we might come back to this in relation to AI, there's a certain conception of a reason for which we act, under which I don't think these reasons are causes of our action. And I still believe this. However, because I think that people conflate different notions of reasons, I do think that there's a perfectly legitimate notion of a reason why someone behaved as they did, where a causal explanation would at least sometimes not be out of place. And what's interesting for me is how the two come together. And when I say things like that, some of my dear friends and fellow non-causalists think I'm a kind of closet causalist after all.
It's a traitor.
And a traitor. And if I can quickly, I have this kind of Wittgensteinian background, but I'm a big fan of Fred Dretske, who is seen as the enemy by some Wittgensteinians. And Dretske distinguishes between triggering and structuring causes. And we don't have time to go into the details of this, but the idea is that there's something that triggers my action, and you can explain my action by pointing to what triggered it, but there's something that explains why this thing triggered my action, as and when, and that's the structuring cause. And for Dretske, even though he uses the word cause, it seems that only one of these is really a cause, and the other provides a kind of causal explanation, but not in the traditional causal sense. So I became very interested in how these things come together. I hope this wasn't too cryptic.
No. Thank you so much. But I think we do need to now move on probably to how this relates to AI, your AI research, but maybe not to jump directly to our title question, which is not a question, it's just a title. It says reasons and robots. And of course, questions would be, do or can robots act for reasons or with reasons? Maybe we need to pave the way to answer that. And maybe, you know, the question would be first more broader. And that is, what do you think about the application of mental words to machines more generally, and of course to intelligent machines or maybe bots? It doesn't need to be robot, it doesn't need to be spatially you know, actualized. It can be static but very speedy thinker. You know, so do you have any, so maybe, you know, it's a kind of, I would like to hear some general introduction into applying mental concepts or terms to machines, and then we can go back to reasons maybe.
Thank you so much, Kogi. You have to stop me if I go on for too long, because I'm very passionate about this particular question right now.
Go for it.
I'll try. So Turing, in the famous paper that we remember for the imitation game, that what's come to be called the Turing test, even though he does of course outline this test, he makes a prediction, and he makes the prediction that it doesn't matter what analytic philosophers think about whether computers can think or not, language is going to change, and by the end of the 20th century we will use the words like think about computers with
That's
no
right.
problem, right?
Yeah.
And it's not because they will pass the Turing test, it's just because the language will evolve in this way. And I think he got that exactly right. I have a view about how this came about. I think this has come about quite intentionally from the tech industry. So today, a lot of philosophers are excited about conceptual engineering. And when philosophers do this, you know, they sit in the armchair and they think, what would be the best concept to have? But what's weird when philosophers do this is it's not clear how, suppose you in your mind come up with the best possible, you know, ameliorated concept. It's not clear how you're meant to bring that into the world from your armchair. And so I like to think that the changes happen in the world and the concepts change the other way around. But tech companies had the power to bring very subtly concepts into the world. And so what you get, if you look at early adverts for computers, they don't say, you know, they don't have computers are intelligent like slogans, but they might implicitly, they might say, now with X amount more memory, or thinks faster than before. So they introduced this kind of language, and pretty soon, I mean, forget, you know, computers and Kasparov and chess and all that. You know, by the 80s, we were talking about my video recorder thinks XYZ. It just became a very kind of loose use of the term, but perfectly legitimate. And I think the next barrier was understanding. Would you like me to, should I?
Yeah. I mean, I would say yes. Thinking, understanding. Yeah, I think.
And now we, you know, we say, and what they do is they don't tell you, Cortana or Siri or Alexa understand you. They will never say that. But what they do is they code it in, so that if I ask something in a muffled voice, Siri will reply, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand that." And the implication is that most of the time she does understand what I'm saying. So it's very subtle.
Indeed.
But I don't think this is wrong. And here I differ from some Wittgensteinians who think computers can't think, they can't understand. And I just kind of think, well, let's see how this word is being used in this context.
So you would say that it is a kind of a question of empirical question in a way. So in terms of computer behavior of the future, or you know, AI behavior in the future, if it is similar enough to some measure of similarity, which is never exact, right? If it is similar enough to human ways of thinking, understanding, that this is really what we should then say, this is understanding in full sense, let's use it, or no, not like that?
Not quite. I don't think it's even a matter of similarity. I think, you know, these things are a bit arbitrary, and the language could go either way, and it's not going to go one way because there's going to be a vote and we're going to decide it's now sufficiently similar to say it's reasoning, or it's now, it doesn't work that way. It's rather that the concepts may or may not loosen up to varying degrees. And I think right now it works for some things, thinking, understanding. It works less well for other mental concepts. I think intending is pretty hard. I think dreaming, and even with memory, we don't really say my machine is reminiscing or recalling in these ways, right? I think trying is getting there with self-driving cars. There'll be contexts where we might say they can try.
So there is definitely, you know, it's almost like a case by case that we can see the change, and it's almost like if I understand it correctly, a descriptive question. How do the communities, that both users and those that promote machines for use of wider society, how they kind of influence this language? It's not like philosophers should pronounce it, or, you know, technicians should just say, oh, now we have discovered it thinks, but it's rather, it becomes habitual, and then it's okay to say it. Is that?
That's exactly right. And of course, you know, the philosopher may be tempted to say, oh, we use this word loosely, but it doesn't really think, or whatever. But really what you end up with is there's something called think star that you think humans can do and machines can't. And that may be interesting in the philosophy seminar, but it's not going to have much sway in everyday practice. I was reading the MA thesis. There's someone called Arturo Vasquez Hernandez who just did an MA in Bergen, and he wrote a thesis on learning and AI. And his view is that while it's okay to use these mental predicates, we can't infer from that the machine has a mind. So he sees the question of, does the machine have a mind, as very different from the question of, is it okay to say it thinks, it tries, and so on. And I think that kind of brings very large questions. It depends what you think a mind is. If you think a mind is a range of abilities and dispositions, then to the extent that we can ascribe these abilities and dispositions to a machine, or indeed an animal, then we might want to say it has a mind. But if you're thinking of the mind as, you know, some kind of entity of some kind of, you know, things get more complicated.
Sure. Konstantin, we have a few questions on Facebook live stream, and maybe we will first start with a question by Daniel Moel-Sharrock, whom you know very well. We both know, the philosopher and a fellow with Genstinian, if we might reveal this. So she says, okay for not interfering with the actual use of language, but shouldn't we show differences as philosophers or in philosophy?
Yes, of course. And as we were saying before with the book with all the conflations, it was all about differences, different senses of the word reason, different senses in which we might say something or someone can think, reason, and so on. But in showing these differences, and I think it's very important to show these differences, but we're not answering some bigger question, does it think or not? You know, you show the differences and there's nothing else left to do. And I think I don't. I speak with Danielle a lot about these issues, and I think we don't disagree on the content, but there's a sort of difference in temperament and style in how we make the point. And my guess is Danielle will think that I'm a little more, maybe, I'm sure she wouldn't say quietist to me, but somehow a little more dissolving rather than answering, providing a solution to a question like, do machines think?
We have two more questions. One was, both of them were actually given earlier, I realized. One is by Florian Franken Figueiredo. Can you give an example for the cases where reasons can be understood as causes? This relates, of course, to earlier discussion in philosophy of action.
So this goes back to the well, if I say that the reason I missed the lecture was that I woke up late, I don't think we have here some consideration that I'm acting in the light. So I don't think I woke up late, therefore I will miss the lecture, right? The explanation doesn't work that way. And indeed, there are causal reasons why just all physiological questions are reason questions, and the answers are always causes. And even ones that sound teleological, like, I don't know, the pump beats, you know, in order to, the heart beats in order to pump blood or something like that. Ultimately, pumping blood is the effect and beating is the cause, and we have a kind of causal explanation, but we can talk of reasons there. It's just not the sense of reasons that some people are interested in. And my view is just that no sense is more legitimate than another.
Right. Yeah. So that's the pluralism bit.
That's the pluralism.
Yeah. Thank you. So then another question we have is by Reza Akbari. Does this speak, any of what you have said, to the hard problem of consciousness? And he adds, I mean, talking metaphysically, not instrumentally. So, you know, does any of this address the hard problem of consciousness, or maybe dissolve?
I don't think so. I mean, I hate to be sort of short. I mean, whether there is a hard problem of consciousness and whether it can be dissolved or not, what I've said so far was not intended to speak to that problem. I suppose, just so that I don't just kind of dismiss the question like this, you may think that something needs to be, people used to think that something needs to be conscious in order for us to apply certain terms, predicates, sentimental predicates to it. And there, I think, again, there's an important sense of these terms where, talking of showing differences, where if you're not if the thing isn't conscious, it doesn't make sense to ascribe certain things to it. Pain, for example.
Sure.
And then, but there may be another sense in which we're quite happy to talk about how a machine playing chess is reasoning, and not because we think it's conscious. But these questions don't touch on the so-called hard problem. Yeah. So sorry to disappoint.
Okay, thank you. I think we are slowly running out of time now. So I think we have addressed, you know, we have sort of paved the way to addressing questions about whether robots can act for reasons. And we don't need to give a simplified answer, I would say. This was enough. Maybe as a last question, this is just one more, not serious question, but I think you made something to say on it. Today is the International Day of Philosophy, right? And International Toilet Day, am I right? And is there any connection between the two in your view or not?
I found out that it's also International Men's Day, whatever that means.
Okay.
So it's a kind of a trifecta or bad trinity. And I don't really follow these things closely, but my understanding is that whereas International Philosophy Day is one of these is a particular date of the year, the 19th, and the other is the third Thursday of November. And so it so happens that this year they coincide. So
Fantastic.
we have one day with 2 descriptions or 3 descriptions. Yeah. But yes, but maybe not next year.
Okay, so no big mysterious connection between these international days then.
I mean, many people think, you know, philosophy belongs in, you know, should be flushed down, but yes. I won't speak to that.
No, let's leave this.
And maybe men as well. So there's a connection there.
This is let's stop with something more uplifting. Our next talk will be at 5 to 4. So we have now about 20 minutes, 25 minutes break, if I may say. No, sorry, what am I saying? So sorry, I have mixed up my my schedule. So we are now at 4:30, and we will start in 10 minutes. Sorry, I made a mistake. Thank you very much, Konstantin, for this conversation. I really enjoyed probing you on some of the things I was also reading and looking forward I can ask you. And thank you for the audience online and here. So we will regroup in 10 minutes, if that's okay. If anybody else wants to ask Konstantin a question, I'm sure you can email him, you know, reach him by email, which can be found online, of course, on. Let me just introduce you, John, if you allow me. John Doran Peters is our next speaker and the final speaker of today. He teaches English and film and media studies at Yale University, but also he engages ideas at the sort of intersection of theology, philosophy, and fiction in his work, and it's exciting to have you with us, John. So I will give the floor to you. Microphone, I think you have. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I screen sharing? Do you see a Rembrandt image?
It works.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. Okay. Basically, my argument today is that we need to criticize traditional understandings of omniscience, both on political grounds, inasmuch as it feeds a certain kind of techno-utopian rhetoric, which comes out of Silicon Valley, and also on moral grounds, because it feeds a kind of divine bookkeeping or vision of perfection of the accounting of human sinfulness and folly, which is debilitating morally. So there's the argument. So at the very beginning of Abrahamic religion, there are large numbers. There are inhumanly large numbers. And the sort of incalculability of grainy objects, such as presumably solid stars in the sky or sand on the seashore, comes together with the covenant which Abraham makes with God. I don't know that this connection between innumerability and the Abrahamic covenant has been emphasized enough, but it is a kind of founding gesture in the history of omniscience to think of God as having unique access to vast catalogs which far surpass human cognition, such as the sands of the sea or the stars of the sky. It seems almost mocking when God says to Abraham, you know, the sands of the sea cannot be numbered for multitude. The suggestion, of course, is not numbered to you. So Abrahamic religion number one, we see this innumeracy, this problem of uncountability. This is also obviously true in Christianity, in one of Jesus's sayings in the Synoptic Gospel of Luke, that, are not five. I'm putting the original text when I actually know the language so you can follow along, but I'll of course translate. But are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 coins? And is not one of them, and then this is the word that I'm interested in, that epilelesmenon, which is from epilanthonomai, the Greek words which can mean like to not notice or to overlook. But the idea is that even one of them does not go without being noticed by God. So here this kind of substance of the metaphor of omniscience has shifted from sands or stars to sparrows, but it's still small solid objects which no human being could ever claim to be able to count. I mean, we could count 5 of them in order to sell them, but we certainly could not count the totality of them, and we certainly could not notice every one of them. The same is also true in Islam, in a famous verse which adorned astrolabes. So here already we see the connection between technology and visions of omniscience, which has only become feverish in modernity, and especially with computation. But still, there's very much the idea that, with God are the keys of the unseen. None knows them except him, and he knows what is on the land and in the sea. Not a leaf falls, but that he knows it. There is no grain, and no grain is there within the darkness of the earth, and no moist or dry thing, but that is written in a clear record. So that here again, we have the kind of parallelism between divine bookkeeping, the clear record, and gritty, grainy, granular objects whose totality is unencompassable by human cognition or human imagination. So, I mean, here we see the centrality of innumerability to the 3 ethical monotheisms as a kind of sign of this is God's monopoly. The numerability, the accounting, the cataloging, the making of a Durchmusterung, as Norbert Wiener calls it, this total atlas or catalog. This is in God's domain. Now, this is the religious tradition of ethical monotheism. There is another tradition, of course, a mathematical tradition, which is quite bold about claiming the ability to reckon in large numbers. And it's fascinating that with Archimedes, this treatise is about sand, and he boldly calculates how many grains of sand there are on Earth and how many grains of matter there would be in the universe. And weirdly, I mean, this is just purely coincidental, but it's fascinating. The number that he comes up with is the Eddington number, or 10 to the 80th power, which is now the accepted estimate of the number of nucleons of elementary particles in the universe. So with Archimedes, there's no bashfulness, there's no shyness, there's no circumspection or embarrassment about claiming to reckon in large numbers. And this is seen as one of the earliest uses of exponents. So we say in English, they're powers. I think that's a wonderful term, 10 to the power of 10, 10 to the power of 80. To think of power in the Foucauldian or other kinds of senses as having to do with exponents is a really interesting one. So in any point, Archimedes gives us tricks of summation, which is not just multiplication, but exponential or geometrical thinking, which allow a kind of totalizing estimate of gigantic numerical totalities. And this is just one example of a long tradition in the Western tradition of mathematical thinking as theological thinking. That is, that mathematics as a kind of royal road to a potential kind of omniscience. So that this is a quote from Whitehead from Science in the Modern World. He's talking about the ways that medieval theology funds modern mathematical and scientific ideas. And the central kind of foundation of that connection of medieval theology and philosophy with modern mathematics is the belief that every detailed occurrence can be correlated with its antecedents in a perfectly definite manner, exemplifying general principles. Every detail was supervised and ordered, yet that is presumably by God. I mean, this is a well-known argument in intellectual history that the vision of divine intelligibility funds notions of scientific rationality and of knowability. What is happening here? Yes, so I mean, Wittgenstein famously says, in mathematics, we know exactly as much as God. And with Wittgenstein, it's as always, you never quite know whether he's praising us for knowing as much as God does, or actually showing that God shares our limits in mathematical knowledge, because Wittgenstein, of course, is very profoundly aware of the kind of collapse of mathematical foundationalism in the early 20th century as argument, partner, inspiration for opponent, enemy, and so on of Bertrand Russell, well known. This kind of vision, of course, of mathematics as a kind of theologically warranted attack or approach to, I should say, uncountables or vastly uncatalogable numerical totalities, of course, feeds lots of technological ideas. So in Isaac Asimov's famous story from 1956, The Last Question, his favorite story of everything which he wrote, of course, sorry for the spoiler alert here, but sorry for the spoiler, is that, and let there be light. So the fundamental gesture of the monotheistic deity is actually the work of a multi-generational, millions and millions of years of computer progress. Or in Norbert Wiener, a fascinating figure who I would argue, and is an inspiration for my argument, that that a divine mind would think pragmatically, would make use of shortcuts. Wiener argues a kind of strategic finitism in this book on God and Golem, and I'm quite convinced. I mean, Norbert Wiener knew William James, his parents were close friends with the James, that Wiener can be read as a kind of pragmatist. Leonard Schoff has heard me make this argument before. So I mean, just at a kind of popular level, an ideological level, the two founders of Google, they look much older now. This is a somewhat dated picture, but Sergey Brin on the left once said, a perfect search engine would be the mind of God. And this sort of flirtation with Kabbalah in computer science, or with the idea that God is the ultimate horizon of knowability, which our artificial intelligence should approach to, is absolutely pervasive. So you can find it in Kevin Kelly, who's the editor of Wired magazine and basically the house philosopher of Silicon Valley, also a Christian. Notice the objects which he includes in his sort of claim that computation can be a theological process. Every mountain, every star, the smallest salamander or woodland tick, each thought in our mind, each flight of a ball is but a web of elemental yes-nos woven together. From this perspective, computation seems almost like a theological process. This argument, of course, is, in terms of intellectual history, is by no means original. You can find similar thoughts in computational founders such as Pascal, Leibniz, and Babbage. I mean, he's recycling in eloquent ways. But I mean, here again, I think it's interesting that he prefers solid objects: mountains, stars, salamanders, ticks, flights of a ball, not thought in our mind. I mean, that's interesting. The sort of fuzzy exception. So you all know this. famous argument about the question of not what is a heap. That's not the interesting question. The interesting question is when is a heap? And we know that 10 grains of rice is not a heap. And we know that a myriad or 10,000 grains of rice is a heap. 10,000, of course, was the biggest number that Archimedes could work with. So that's why he had to myrias, the Greek term. But we all know also that if you start taking away a grain of rice from a massive pile, that at some point it's not going to be a heap anymore, but you can't really say at some point. You can actually say more likely at a kind of band of intermediacy, in which there isn't a point. There's a line or a plane, perhaps, to think Euclideanly. I mean, this is also the famous question raised about how long is the coast of England that Lewis Fry Richardson raised. Mandelbrot is more famous for raising it. And of course, the length of the coast of Britain depends upon your measuring stick. And there's a fractal relationship of dimensionality, which is constant actually between measuring sticks and length. But the longer the measuring stick you have, the shorter the length is going to be. The finer the measuring stick, the longer the coast of England is going to be. But there is no ultimate level of magnification which you're going to overcome this fundamental fuzziness. So since many of you are in a country I've lived in for 3 years, ik hou heel erg van Nederland and the schilderijen van Nederland. I love the Netherlands and Dutch painting. One of my favorite paintings is by Ruisdael, Gezicht op Haarlem, one of his many Haarlempjes, or images. And I think if we were to think of clouds rather than grains of sand as the objects that a divine mind might want to understand, it might be more interesting in the ways that we think about what omniscience would look like, because we would have to have a conception of knowledge and of omniscience, which would be probabilistic, which would be about estimates. So there's another nice Wittgenstein point. He's actually talking about images, and the point here, sometimes in a fuzzy image, an unsharp image is often the one that we use. But I think you can also just take das Unscharfe, not just as das Unscharfe Bild, but as das Unscharfe as a general principle of vagueness. Isn't perhaps vagueness precisely what we need? So maybe you know about the great internet Mersenne prime search, which is a massive computing project of network computing. It's been going about 25 years. This is the largest prime number yet discovered. Now, Scott Aronson, in a series of philosophical reflections about computational complexity, asks whether we can actually know such a number. To print it out would require thousands of densely packed pages, and no intelligence with a human lifespan could possibly count that high. But somehow we feel that we know this number in a way that we don't know the 52nd yet to be discovered Mersenne prime. And yet it seems also strange to say that we know what the 51st Mersenne prime is when, as if we know what 2 or 3 or 5 or 7. It's unclear whether 1 is prime or not, because it's unclear whether 1 is a number or not, obviously. But do we understand 2 or 3, 2, 3, 5, or 7 any better than we understand M? I'm not even going to list that number. It exceeds me. I'll leave it to a divine mind to express it. So, I mean, but is there any bandwidth of intelligence that can make this number perfectly known? Would we imagine a divine mind just skipping blithely between the 51st, the 52nd, the 53rd, and the Aleph Not numbers of primes. So what would it mean if we thought of a divine mind using fuzzy logics and benefiting from the powers of vagueness and generality? Would a divine mind be able to think in terms of et ceteras? Would a divine mind be able to use heuristics and shortcuts, estimates, probabilities? What if God were a pragmatist? What if God used abduction? We know from the history of statistics that the price paid for big data sets is the need to reckon in confidence intervals, in probabilities. You can't speak of sureties, but you can measure the likelihood of being wrong. This means that for large objects, large numbers, we're actually talking about imperfection, not totality, useful imperfection. Would a divine mind skip over the intermediate steps? Would a divine mind use anything but heuristics? Now, just to conclude, Aronson asks about the difference between what is infinite for us, according to current technology, and infinite per se, and then asks the radical question, is there such a thing? Is there a clear distinction? He argues in a way very similar to Einstein that upper limits, such as the speed of light, are not simple artifacts of current processing power, but are inherent bounds in cosmic order. This is a point about media ontology. Our ability to process numbers is not external to their being, but enters into them. Does it seem too anthropocentric to say that the possible use of knowable numbers is bounded by the strength of our computational capacity? Putting it even more strongly, and I'm not sure how strong I want to back this claim, the size and the duration of the universe has a direct effect on the kinds of philosophical questions we can ask and answer. And even more radically, the kinds of questions we can ask and answer have a direct effect on the size and duration of the universe. The universe is too short-lived to process the carrying capacity for many of the most important calculations. And it is not clear even if quantum computing or other kinds of divine crunching powers would change this. So computational complexity, which was once relegated to engineers as a merely practical problem in efficiency or technique, now turns out to be a central epistemological problem about the limits of anthropological knowledge, and I would also argue divine knowledge. Because if you have a universe with a finite lifespan, the ultimate processing capacity of any device, human or divine, and the limits to ultimate possible knowledge would all be intimately linked. In other words, the physical limits of the means of knowing are made of the same stuff as with the objects to be known, which suggests an inevitable bound to knowledge or an inevitable essential blurriness. So one final point, since we've already mentioned Joseph Smith today, I thought I would mention him again as he's quoting the Bible. But he who has repented of his sins, the same is forgiven, and I, the Lord, remember them no more. This language is so fascinating because it doesn't quite suggest a deletion of divine knowledge, but it does suggest that there are holes in divine knowledge. So I hope, and we all hope, I think, that God's mind is like Swiss cheese in which there are full of voids that mark the spots where people's sins and follies and pain and suffering has all been forgiven and forgotten. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this very interesting, intriguing lecture, I would say. I will definitely remember this metaphor, divine mind as a Swiss cheese, as summing up certain things that you were making actually in different way throughout the talk. I would now invite other participants for questions. I see Nadia with the camera on, and I see other people. I don't know whether they are there or not, but I hope they are. Leonard is here. Are there any questions, please?
And if I can just note that my co-author on the Wiener paper, I've invited to join Benjamin Peters on our paper on Wiener as pragmatist. So that's why he's here.
Yeah.
For the
Hello.
panel.
Hello, Benjamin.
Okay.
Welcome.
Okay.
Great. So I also should add also that, you know, Facebook audience is there, and if they have a question, they can ask questions in chat as they have done before. But does anybody here have a question in the Zoom room? So if not, I will maybe start, John, and ask you something about the idea. So if I understand you correctly, so divine omniscience is a particular problem that presents itself in as an ethical problem, as a political problem. Now I have sort of I could see how it could become an ethical problem, but in political sense, where would you say is the most sort of, it clearly could be seen, or where should we kind of look for the damaging effects of the omniscience doctrine in politics, you think?
Yes, I'm thinking particularly of the way that notions of divine omniscience are hijacked by the IT industry. And the kind of, you know, there's obviously a whole history of the kind of demonic idea of the divine mind, Big Brother, and so on. But the way that the sort of benign omniscience of Google pretending to, I mean, obviously what Google does is shape the world. What Facebook claims to be doing is just omnisciently connecting people benignly together in community, when we all know that that's not what's happening. So I guess I'm thinking more specifically on the kind of maybe I should say techno-political. Although I would still argue that democratic life, this is a Dewey point, Leonard brought up Dewey earlier, that democratic life depends upon learning processes, and that learning processes involve a kind of noch nicht, a negation of an imperfection. And that's why I think that sort of, if you think of a divine mind as potentially learning, that is a much more democratic way, because it allows God to participate in the ongoing drama of the universe, rather than you know, the remote deus absconditus, which is just passing judgment and letting everybody make messes out of things.
Thank you for this thought. I guess my thought was also in relation, for example, Google, Facebook, the giants that in a way control many of our lives in interesting and dark ways. Now we know. I guess would be something like, you know, God is patient and really benevolent, but these are just imposters, and we can see how imperfect they are. I mean, first it seems omniscient, it seems how good it all is, and then in a few years we see that you know, democratic process is disrupted, our privacy is endangered, and so on. And I'm just imagining a sort of orthodox three omnis God you know, proponent, how that they might probably answer in this way. But I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud.
They'd probably say, I mean, they'd probably say that's an abuse, you know, of the genuine conception that the abuse does not ruin the use. And so just because, you know, a good idea of omniscience can be destroyed doesn't mean that omniscience is inherently bad. I mean, I follow that argument, but I mean, my own theological perspective is very finitist, it's very pragmatist. And I mean, you know, obviously the question of theodicy is another way in which we can say that the political need to think beyond omniscience, you know, has an obvious political payoff.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't excuse suffering in the way that we are tempted to with the typical three omnis.
Sure. Other questions? I think Noreen, I can see. Yes.
Yeah, John, you just raised my question, which was about theodicy. You know, the fact that the three omnis get us into trouble, because obviously they cannot all three be true in a world of suffering. But I'd like to go back to your, you know, look at the mathematical types of infinity and say, could we not argue that God can be infinitely powerful infinitely benevolent, you know, and infinitely knowledgeable, and yet there would still be gaps because, you know, just as we have an infinite number of integers, we know that we have gaps of all the real numbers in between two integers, and yet that does not take away from the infinity of the integers. This would seem to fit with some, you know, more recent theology, such as Thomas Oord's book, God Can't, which is basically saying, here's a way that we can now deal with this theodicy problem without taking away from the, without making God finite. I wonder if you could just comment on that.
That's really fantastic, the kind of theological resonance of the diagonal proof, right? That there's always space, there's always something that's on not there. I'm just thinking in terms of like the way that Cantor was so important for Josiah Royce. You know, a thinker who's also important for me, and sort of thinking through, you know, the map on, you know, Borges loves this map that Royce gets, I think, ultimately from Cantor, about the map on the sands of England, and the map has to contain the map within the map. But the question is, you know, can you ever do that? I mean, does it ever stop? Sorry, I'm not making sense. I'm saying I think you've got a great idea.
I've published an article on that. If you would be interested in it, I'd be happy to send you a copy.
I would be thrilled. Thank you.
Drop me an email and I'd be happy to send it to you.
Perfect. Thank you.
We have a question that appeared on Facebook, or a comment that I think hints at the question. Reza Akbari says, it's a new way of projecting God in the picture of mathematics. Former humans were projecting God as what has brought them wonder. So in a way, he's making a distinction between like old gods that were not so focused on mathematics, and then at some point mathematics became like this. I guess this is Reza's idea. I'm guessing. Do you have any comment on that, John?
I mean, I think that was partly what I was thinking about, with the difference between the kind of biblical or Quranic deity who conjures these massive numbers versus the kind of medieval or modern deity in which God is a little mathematician, or the mathematician is a little God, as I believe that Cusanus says somewhere. So yeah, I mean, I think that contrast makes a lot of sense. I mean, the only question I would have is, it seems like what's more wonderful than mathematics, actually. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to make too hard a distinction between mathematics and the wondrous.
Indeed, yes. I mean, many philosophers of mathematics would say also that mathematics, in its purity, this is the, you know, top wonder. That's why it would have religious significance and so on. Thank you. Is there any other question or at this point? If not, we will probably draw today to first day of our symposium to a close. I would like to thank everybody. Thank you, John, again for your question, for your lecture. Sorry, it was really interesting. And thank you, everybody else, all the speakers. Thank you, dear viewers, and all of those on Facebook. Thank you for your questions. Tomorrow we meet again at 2 o'clock, hopefully exactly on time, hopefully without, and not hopefully, I'm pretty sure tomorrow is going to be without technical problems, but one can never be too sure about that. So goodbye for today, and see you all tomorrow.
Goodbye.
Hello, one more thing. Can I just add one more thing before we finish?
Yes, Jasper.
Very short technical thing. As we know, because of the technical issues, the first, say, half an hour of the stream is missing on Facebook. So this will be added this evening. For everyone that is watching via Facebook, you will miss nothing. Everything will be provided to you until this evening in an edited form. So thank you very much for staying. Thank you very much for patience, and to all the speakers today. It was excellent.
Excellent. Thank you, Gasper. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Goodbye.
Bye.